Anyway, okay. Back to what we're doing. We're live and in Technicolor. I'm Mary C. Anderson.
And I'm Nancy Bergman, and this is the
History Files.
This is another kitchen edition.
Dead of winter.
However, it's not as cold as it was.
No, it's actually pretty balmy today.
Yep.
I came without a coat. Coat and gloves are in the car just in case, because you never know when the other shoe's going to drop.
And that's interesting because that's a perfect segue into our program today.
Yeah, we kind of got broadsided. We had a comfortable December and a comfortable January. And then all of a sudden February came.
And it smacked us.
It smacked us right where Mother Nature knows to hit us best, in the thermometer. And down we went. Today they're forecasting almost a 60-degree temperature difference from where we were a week ago.
Yes. Oops.
Yeah.
What, is she throwing up something on the floor? She better not be.
What
is she eating?
She's all
eating?
excited.
God, I don't know.
All excited.
Just a minute. Viewing public and Mary, she's going to go outside.
Okay.
Yes, if you're going to throw up in front of us, maybe it's better for you to go outside.
I think we're going to edit that part out.
There we go. Okay.
That's the wonderful thing about WTCO Channel 18 is that we have fantastic editors.
Moi.
There we go. Cut it out.
Now, about our last 3 programs have been what I've got to call our winter programs. We did 2 ice fishing contests.
Yes.
And
we braved the cold. We did brave the cold for both of them.
And then we talked about the lumberjacks, and that was really in the winter as well.
Yes.
So today we're going to do one more cold weather program here. Oh, and the ice sculptures.
Oh, yeah, the ice sculptures.
We went over and saw the ice sculptures. So now we're going to do one more program that kind of deals with the cold weather.
Okay.
And then hopefully we'll be moving into our spring.
Well, the weatherman is cautiously optimistic that we're in a warming trend.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I'm ready for spring.
But the thing of it is, even this time of the year, we can be caught off guard with what, Nancy? Unexpected
cold weather or snow.
And blizzards.
Right, yeah.
You can have blizzards in March.
And Mary, have you ever been in a for real blizzard?
Yes.
Where was that?
It was, I do believe, either the late 70s or early 80s out in Stag Coulee, and it snowed and the temperature dropped, and they had to actually run a string from the barn to the house. And it was so cold that, the water cups were freezing and the barn was freezing, and it was snowing and blowing, and it was like a 3-day event.
Oh my goodness.
And they couldn't get the milk trucks in and out of the valleys. But that, I guess, would be as close as I would.
It's what we would, for us here in this part of Wisconsin, call a blizzard.
Yes. Our blizzards are different than blizzards elsewhere.
I have to say that the closest I ever came to a blizzard, and it really wasn't, was when I was driving down in Illinois, in Champaign County, which is, flat as a board.
Yep.
And it was snowing, and, I really couldn't tell where the sky and the horizon, the land met.
Oh, really?
It was just like a big curtain. And it wasn't, there wasn't any wind. But it was very disorienting, and I could see if there had been a lot of wind, and especially if it was swirling around you, it would be disorienting. You really would have a hard time knowing what was up and down and, and where you were going.
Well, have you ever driven in a heavy snow in the dark when it's windy like that?
Yeah.
And you can't find your perspective as to where the road is?
Right.
And, then just slow down.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So what we're going to talk about today was something that happened in 1988. And
1988?
I'm sorry.
1888.
Yes. And it was really a terrible thing, it didn't happen here in Wisconsin, but it had far-reaching implications for the whole country and us here in Wisconsin. And it was called the school children's blizzard, or the children's blizzard.
Okay.
And it happened in 1888 on January 12th. And what had happened is there'd been a big snow on January 6th, and then there had been, what follows a big snow, lots of times a cold snap.
Right.
Where it got way down below zero. And it was like that for about, 5 days. And then all of a sudden this warm air mass came up, probably out of the Gulf, they thought. And it warmed up. I mean, it went up from like way below zero to up to like 30.
Kind of like what we're having.
Yes.
Okay. This is kind of ominous.
And so everybody was outside. People started walking into town, and the school children went out and went to their schools. People were outdoors. They were visiting neighbors. It was just so wonderful.
A nice spring hiatus in January.
It was a real January thaw, and they were taking advantage of it. Well, as this warm air came up from the Gulf, at the same time, this terrible cold front was coming down from Canada.
We know those now to be polar vortexes,
Yes,
right?
or Alberta Clippers.
There you
or
go.
Whatever. Anyway, it was all the Canadians' fault.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what happened, of course, is that warm, moist air hit this cold front, and it set off this mega storm.
Okay.
And this was on, like I say, January 12th. And the temperatures, they just went right down when the cold front collided with this warm air.
And I'm sure there was snow involved at that.
There
Probably
was.
that mix of snow, ice, as the storm builds, it just builds upon itself. It just keeps getting worse.
And the storm came up really fast. Now, we're talking about, this was out on the plains where it's
Right.
flat, and this storm just came up, whoomph. There wasn't like, I see some clouds there in the distance, where you
Where
might
it's
have
building,
a couple
yeah.
hours. It just came whack. And they said it had hurricane force winds.
Wow. One
Like-
of those crazy freak storms, kind of like what hit Iowa last summer.
Yeah.
Leveled all that corn
Right.
and all those crops.
More like that. It was like, they said the winds were like a hurricane. They were so strong, and it was blowing this snow. And of course, being out there in the flat, people couldn't tell, this.
No
this-
orientation points.
Right.
Oh boy.
So all these people
This
that
doesn't
were
sound good.
outside, maybe, halfway between town and home, and all these kids out there in the rural schools, the teachers really weren't sure what to do when this storm came up. Their first thought was they needed to get the kids home. And so a lot of them released the kids right away and, told them to go on home. Some of them wouldn't let the kids go. They kept them there in the schoolhouse. But that had its problems too. Those schoolhouses weren't exactly well insulated.
Well, no, and they're probably being heated with wood, and if you've got a room full of children, you've got to feed them.
Yes, exactly. And it wasn't, a lot of them were heating actually with coal because
Okay.
there wasn't a lot of wood out
Oh
there.
yeah, because
on
they
the
didn't
plains.
have the resource.
And they probably didn't have a whole lot stacked in there. So it was a hard choice, but the teachers weren't sure what to do. And some of these, as this terrible storm came up, some of the teachers took the kids and said that they were going to try to go with them and get them home again.
Okay.
And in one case, one teacher they said that she found a rope or something and she kind of tied the kids to her. Because otherwise, if you don't know, if you get disoriented, you could be wandering around out there on the prairie
Yeah.
and have no idea.
And there's no shelter.
No. That's the thing that always bothered me when I go down to Illinois and it's flat. It's like, there's nowhere to hide. It makes me really kind of anxious.
Well, yeah, definitely.
So I can imagine how bad this must have been.
Well, and the poor kids, 'cause
Yeah.
I'm sure they were scared.
And they didn't have the clothing and things that we have now. They
No,
didn't have
no.
the insulated boots. They didn't have like the snowmobile suits.
No.
The insulation. They were lucky if they had a coat, and that had been
Right.
such a warm day. A lot of them maybe didn't even take the coat with them.
Yeah, they could have left those things at home.
Right. So this was terrible because all these people got trapped out on the prairie in this storm, and especially the kids. Now they said that in the first few hours the temperatures dropped from plus 32 to 40 below. Meanwhile, there's this heavy wind,
Yeah.
and the snow is real light.
Yep.
Not the heavy, wet stuff, but
No.
the light stuff.
When it's that cold, it's almost like ice crystals.
Yeah.
And that had to be piercing
Brutal.
with that kind of gale force wind behind it. They didn't stand a chance, did they?
No, although some of them that did survive, and this was back in the days when people would thresh and they'd leave a big straw stack.
Okay.
You remember what
Yeah.
they looked like?
Yeah.
Okay. What they did is if they came up upon one of these, they burrowed into it
Okay.
to stay warm.
Kind of nested in like an igloo.
What were you going to do?
Yeah. There was no trees.
No.
No protection.
No. So they got it. And some teachers did get the kids into these, got them into these straw stacks and tried to keep them warm and everything. But I mean, this didn't happen just for a couple hours. This storm went on. I think they said was it a couple of days? It was
wow.
a long, long storm. And they said one of the reasons there was a couple of reasons why it was so deadly. One thing, the timing, it came up midday when everybody was out and around.
Okay.
And all the kids were in school.
Yeah.
Where if it had come up at, when...
Short time.
Short
Everybody
time.
would have been home.
Yes, or in the middle of the night.
Right.
But this came in midday. And it came up so suddenly. We talked about that, how it just boom, here came this storm. And it had the strong, strong winds and that powdery snow,
Yeah.
which was just a real deadly combination.
Wow. Plus multiple days.
Yes. And the total, when the storm was all done, the total death toll was 235.
Wow. That's a lot of people for a snowstorm.
And a lot of them were kids, were school kids that didn't make it home or
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
into a straw stack or any place like that.
Well, we know how freak storms can wreak havoc. Look at what just happened to Texas a week ago.
Right.
Right? Week and a
That's
half
right.
ago. And they weren't ready.
No, they certainly weren't. We'll get some
And
pictures up here
who would
too.
ever expect that it would be that cold, that far south, with really storm system after storm system after storm system rolling through the neighborhood?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Crazy.
And it affected quite a few states. These are the states that the storming wasn't just one small place.
Okay.
Big storm. It affected South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska,
Wow.
Kansas, Minnesota,
Okay.
Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho.
Wow, that's a large
Yeah.
storm.
And I suppose they maybe got some of it here in Wisconsin, but not like it was out on the prairie.
They have to run out of energy sometime.
Yep. Thank goodness it didn't make it here. But we wouldn't have been quite, our hills and trees do help us.
Yes, they
They do break the wind.
Yes.
And so you can imagine these parents, they don't know where their kids are, they don't know where their husband or the people are, and they wanted to have some way to guide them home. And so if they had a bell, they would
Okay.
ring it, or a whistle,
Okay.
just anything. But even so, you wonder if that noise would have really carried through all that wind.
Well, yeah. I mean, any type of a wind is going to change the carry of your voice.
Right. So, but they tried. What
Yeah.
else can you do?
Right.
And the snow was so much and so bad, it collapsed a bunch of grain elevators.
Okay.
And we know how snow can do that. Was
Yes.
it 2 years ago?
Yeah, everybody was worried about roofs and shoveling
Yeah.
roofs, and barns were going down, and it was chaotic.
Yeah. Did you have anything go down?
No, but we wrote a nice check to some very thrifty young men who I think quickly pulled together a crew and ran around shoveling.
Yep, we did too. We had a crew from over in Fly Creek came over and shoveled off one of our building roofs, and thank goodness for that.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
was one of those things where there was a noticeable change, and it's like, okay, if we get any more snow and ice, we're not going to have a shed.
Because it was heavy snow.
Oh yeah.
I mean, heavy,
Well,
wetter snow.
And it came in such bursts. I mean, we
Yeah.
had it was like weekend storm after weekend storm, and each one of them was 12 to 20 inches.
Yeah.
With ice and the whole 9 yards. It was chaos.
So, of course, we got to think about these people that were living in these states. And this was in the period when there had been a lot of people homesteading, taking up land. And they were out there on the prairie, pretty remote.
Well, and I'm going to guess pretty ill-equipped.
Probably.
For the environment that they were moving into.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the first winter in a new house. You don't know if it's going to be warm or cold, or you don't know how you're going to get through it until you get through it.
And when it came to insulation, I don't think they really had insulation like we understand it. They said they used to put up newspapers on their walls to try to keep drafts out, anything you could.
Yeah.
In Europe, a lot of people, their barn is connected to their house.
Okay.
And so they even use some of that animal heat to keep their house warm. I suppose you could bring your cattle into your kitchen if you had to.
Well, it would kind of get a little crowded.
Yeah.
But
you do what you got to do.
That's right. You got to keep warm. That's incredible.
And out of this storm, it really got a lot of attention with the newspapers and things. And they, back then, sometimes nowadays we think our newspapers are pretty, sensationalistic. Mm-hmm. Believe me, back then they were really sensationalistic.
Well, we read some newspapers that go into far details.
Yes.
Than what were.
And they made up a lot of things.
Oh, yeah. Well, no really, fax checks.
Yeah.
Or whatever those.
Right. So they had some really dramatic things here. They really talked about this one teacher, I think she was out in Nebraska, the one that tried to keep the kids together with a rope.
Okay.
And was trying to get them home, and she wound up getting them into a haystack or a straw stack. And eventually, the storm ended, and then the bottom just fell out of the temperatures. It got way below zero. Yes. We know how that goes.
Yes.
And so people went out looking for all the people that were missing, and that's when they came across some pretty bad things. There were people that did survive, by getting into these haystacks and things that did. But they also, like all these 13 kids and this teacher, some of them were frostbitten, especially on their fingers and their toes.
Okay.
So a lot of adults and children wound up losing toes or feet.
Oh.
Yeah.
That had to be a hard thing to recover from.
Yeah.
Given the day.
Right.
The day and the technology. And so I'm sure that it wasn't a good thing.
Well, and that was before they had the super prosthetics like people can get now.
Right, right.
If you lost a foot or a leg or something, you were, it was really going to impact your life. But this school teacher that managed to save these children by getting them into the great big haystacks and things. There was even a song, the song of the Great Blizzard of 1888. 13 were saved.
13 were saved.
Yes, and she became like a national
hero.
She
or
did.
Heroine, right?
Yes.
Heroine.
Yep. And I think that she did have some damage. I'm not sure if she lost a foot or something. She also suffered frostbite, but they did manage to keep these kids alive.
And that's incredible.
And that was amazing because so many of them were lost.
Yeah.
And then here was all this snow, so they were under the snow.
And then how do you find them? You have to wait.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and they went out looking, and I suppose a lot of people did not get found until after the snow had
subsided,
melted somewhat. It was, and then there was the story, and I've told you this before. It was horrendous because it was 5 young men, cousins and brothers, that got caught out in that snowstorm, and they kind of never came to the house. And so after the storm dissipated and they went out looking for them in that bitter cold, they found this lump. And they, brushed the snow away, and here was this pile of these 5 guys in a body. They'd gotten into a pile to try to keep each other warm. And but none of them lived.
Oh no!
And so here they had these kids were all frozen together in one big lump, more or less, hideous as this is. And so what were they going to do? They didn't want to just leave them out there on the prairie.
Well, you can't because there's predators.
Yeah, and it was this. So what they had to do was they had to get them. They got them on a wagon or a sled. This big lump of these 4 or 5 boys, and they brought them to the house.
And thawed them out.
They had to bring them into the house and put them in front of the stove to thaw. And they said that the mother,
wow.
that was it. She just kind of had a broke down and had a real serious.
Yeah.
You can imagine how awful that was.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Terrible.
And really there was no other option for them to deal with such a horrible situation.
No, it was a terrible thing. And it did have some long-reaching effects. And the one thing was it really kicked off the study of meteorology in the country.
Oh, okay.
And
storm tracking, I bet.
right, and so the people actually studied weather and weather trends, and to have a national weather forecasting service, because they did have telegraph. So they could, telegraph and everything. But of course, that probably wasn't much use if you were out there on the prairie and your closest neighbor was 6 miles away.
Well, and the telegraph machine is in town,
Right.
and that's another 10 miles away.
Right.
So they didn't have the law. I mean, you can hear a siren. Can you hear the Whitehall sirens when they go?
It depends on what way the wind is coming that day.
Yeah. And see, we can sometimes hear Whitehall, and sometimes we can hear Pigeon.
Yeah.
I suppose you could almost hear Arcadia, Independence, and Whitehall.
Can hear Independence and Whitehall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Too many ridges between
Right.
here and
Depends,
Arcadia.
like I say, depends on where the wind is coming from that day.
And so that was a positive thing
That was a good thing, yes.
that came out of tragedy.
Right.
And hopefully Texas will do the same.
Yes, and in spite of all, I mean, we can sit here on our little, devices on our phones and iPads and our laptops, and we could call up weather
can watch-
maps,
yeah.
and we know what's probably going to happen.
Nancy, in 20 minutes, the storm is going to be headed your way from my place.
That's right. And, it's incredibly accurate.
Yeah, it is.
I sometimes, because weather, they say, is chaotic by nature. It doesn't always follow rules. But you can call up some of these things on your internet, and it'll show the clouds coming, and
Yes.
it'll say it's going to start snowing in 1 hour, and they're right.
Yes.
Yes. So we really have,
We're
it's a
spoiled.
wonderful thing. It is. And of course, these poor people living out there on the prairie,
Not a chance.
they didn't have anything like that. So the other thing that was the outcome of this storm is, like I said, 1888, and from like 1860 to 1888, there had been a lot of people moving out into these prairie states to
Well, wasn't it Go West?
go west and homestead.
Homestead.
Yes. So what happened after the storm was that trend reversed.
Really?
A lot of people seemed to realize that they were in over their heads and that maybe this wasn't a good idea. Because there was a lot of people that homesteaded and moved out there that had maybe, been a factory worker or a shoemaker or something before. So they were really, really out of their league.
Well, I think today sometimes people move to the country and think it's just this beautiful panacea of daisies and sunshine.
Yes.
Until you get a storm that locks you in, or you get an ice storm and you can't get out your driveway because it's 100%
That's
glare
right,
ice.
yeah.
It's not easy, and nobody's going to plow you out but you. You got to be resilient.
And back then, most of these homes they were living in, they were just boards.
They were
wasn't-
shacks,
Yes,
Nancy.
shanties or whatever
Yeah.
you want to call it.
And
Very simple.
Out on the prairie, most of them had a sod component
Yeah.
of some form, whether
lot
it
of
was
them.
the roof or some of the sidewalls, because that was their building materials.
And actually, they said those sod houses were pretty warm. They were
Oh.
pretty well insulated.
I often wonder, because it was prairie mat.
Yeah.
And they cut it in big chunks.
Slabs, yeah.
So think of it like block, but living block.
Yes. They said it was good insulation. The only problem was that you constantly had dirt falling down on you. Yes.
So maybe that, the extra protein or something kept them, healthy soils, right?
Yes,
Healthy
yep.
soils grow healthy people.
So for some of these women, there was no way they could ever keep this clean. I mean, it was just a real struggle. And so that's why most of these sod houses did not stay inhabited.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would assume with a sod roof, if it rained, when it rained, because the west is drier, that you were drippy.
And things got up there. I'm sure there were mice and I read a funny thing about in Nebraska where they were having church services in a home, and the guy wrote in his diary that he had a hard time paying attention to the sermon that day because he could see there were snakes up there in the roof, in the sod roof, and he found that very distracting.
I would have a hard time concentrating on the sermon if there was a snake in church.
Yes.
Yeah, I get that. Oh, those poor people, what they put up with.
I know it.
Would a modern couple today be able to tolerate that in a home? I don't think so.
I don't think so. I'll put up with quite a bit, but I draw the line at snakes in the ceiling. So.
And they called that the American dream, right?
But a lot of our early settlers in this county had kind of burrowed into hillsides and that at first before they were able to get their houses up. And
well, you got to have shelter.
Yeah, they were dugouts, and it was probably not a bad thing to do. Just as long as you weren't going to do it long range, because it made housekeeping rather
challenging.
Difficult. So that was the children's blizzard, and like I say, it got a lot of play in the newspapers.
Well, and it sounds like even though it was a horrific tragedy, it really brought good things.
Yes, it did. It was a terrible thing, but the long-reaching effects there was more, study, and they started the National Weather Forecasting Service, and it also had a lot of these people realize that maybe the idea of moving out onto the plains and by yourself and having this big farm and homestead was really not real practical for them.
Right.
Because this is what could happen.
And a lot of those states are, I'm not going to say sparsely populated, but if you compare them to other states,
they're not dense, are
they're
they?
not dense. Not dense at all. And I know folks who have moved out to those places for the peace and the quiet.
Yeah, and I mean, but everything has its pluses and minuses.
Everything costs.
Yes,
there is no free lunch.
Right.
If you live 20 miles from anyone, you're going to be stuck 20 miles from anyone.
That's right.
Oh goodness.
So this was this terrible, terrible storm where all these people died. And but it just had far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, and look how far we've come. Now we have weather the touch of a finger.
At our fingertips. Yeah.
Hour by hour, we can tell what the temperature's going to be.
It's and it's really wonderful. You can look on there and see exactly what's going to happen that day, and there probably aren't going to be any big surprises. And the other thing be, if those nice Canadians up there would just keep their nasty cold weather in Canada.
That's right. They usually throw it to us a couple of times, although it wasn't that many years ago that we had the entire month of January. I think there was only like one day that was above zero.
Oh, I remember that, yes.
It was just bitterly cold day after day after day. Huh.
So what happens then is after you get used to being below zero for such a long time, if it gets up above zero, it's like,
T-shirt weather.
Yes.
Spring is coming.
You go downtown and people are in shorts and everything else. So it's all what you get used to. Terrible children's blizzard of 1888, and it's a real good segue into the topic of homesteading.
Well, yeah. That was a big thing in the day.
It was huge, and a lot of people think that this area, Trempealeau County, was homesteaded. Well, there was a few places, but actually, most of the white people started moving into this county in the 1850s. And the Homestead Act came in 1862.
Okay, so now they called it homesteading because of the Homesteading Act.
Right.
Which was legislation that did what?
Well, this was by Lincoln.
Okay.
And there was a lot of push then because the United States had all that land out west there, and there wasn't really anybody in it.
No, unclaimed.
Right. And the railroads thought it would be good if, they'd put railroads through, but they had to have something that would be shipped,
Yeah.
business, so they had a lot of land. And so they started this Homestead Act. That was 1862. And by that time, most of the land in this county had already been taken up.
Okay.
Yeah, it had been either, purchased by land speculators, and there were a lot of them. Although I did see that some of the land up in like Chimney Rock.
Yeah, but that was land that was pretty rough.
Right.
The best land for some type of agriculture was going to go first.
It got snapped up.
It got snapped up.
Exactly right. So,
And unfortunately, township of Chimney Rock is a beautiful, beautiful township, just not under the plow.
right. So a lot of that land up there actually got homesteaded. And I have seen a few instances too in the town of Hale and a couple in Pigeon, but like you say, most of it was already, by the time the Homestead Act came around, it was already, bought, paid for, and everything.
Yep.
But Lincoln started this, 1862, May 20th, and that's when the Homestead Act, and he had said that this was for citizens or future citizens.
Oh.
So you did not have to be a citizen of the United States to homestead.
Okay, so it was open to immigrants.
Right.
Of which the population at the time, people were getting out of Europe.
Yep.
All
Yep.
over the place. Get me out of here.
That's right, because there wasn't any opportunity. And the other thing was, it was kind of ahead of its time in that it was open to either men or women.
Oh, they allowed women?
Women could homestead, yes.
Wow.
And that was radical.
Yeah, for the day.
Yes. And also, you could be a black person. You could be African American and you could homestead.
Wow.
So for its day, 1862, this was...
Pretty progressive.
It was. And what it was, you could get 160 acres.
Okay.
And but it was only a small fee. I think they said registration fee was $6.
Okay.
And what you had to do was you had to live on this land for 5 years.
Okay.
And you had to improve it, which meant you had to plow.
Right.
Or, farm at least 10 acres out of that 160.
Well, for a man in the day, that's a lot of ground. Even 10 acres because it's all by hand.
Right.
With horses. That's a lot of ground.
And it said, it also said that, you had 5 years to what they called prove up on it.
Okay.
Meaning that you had lived on it continuously and that you had improved it. You started the farm, you made improvements to it.
Maybe built a house. Yep. Yeah.
And if you wanted to, maybe after a couple of years, if you didn't want to wait the 5 years, but you wanted that, you could do what they call preempted, and that meant you could go in and buy it, and I think it was for $1.25 an acre.
Wow. Land in Trempealeau County is a far cry from $1.25 an acre now.
And this is also what Lincoln said. He said the purpose of the homesteading was to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial burdens from all shoulders,
Oh.
and to give everyone an unfettered start and a fine chance in the race of life.
Everybody except the Native Americans.
Well, yeah, they kind of lost out on this deal again,
brother.
didn't they? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was good for...
It sounds good on paper.
Yeah.
And in practice, it generated the shift west.
Yeah, a huge amount of people moving out there
Yeah.
to take up this land. And they had, a lot of advertisements, and they advertised in Europe and places.
Well, at one time, it was just the Dakota Territory. It was the Dakotas were all
right, it
just
wasn't all
north
made
and
up
south.
into states, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So what happened is when an area became open for homesteading, they would put up these land offices, and that was where you would go in, and they'd have a map of the tracts that were available.
Okay.
And then you would file your claim on that tract.
Wow.
Yeah.
Neat.
So, and that, they said the first person to file a homestead after, it was like after midnight when it became possible to do that, was a man by the name of Dan Freeman. And the first homestead was out in Beatrice, Nebraska, which is where my mother-in-law was from.
Oh, okay.
And if you go out there today, they have a homesteading museum that is great.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, it's really well put together, and it's surrounded by this Nebraska prairie, which is different than what we get around here, a little more arid.
Yeah.
But very interesting. And so it was like, and also they also had, they figured that they had 270 million acres of land that were claimed.
270 million.
71 million
acres.
acres that
Wow.
were homesteaded and settled. And out of that 270 million, there were 4 million that were actually proved up on.
Really?
Yes, there was a real high rate of
Get me out of here.
of disaster, of failure. Let's face it, failure.
Well, and again, the land was so different.
Yeah.
The weather was so different. The soils are so different.
Well, this was prairie, and you know what prairie is like.
Yes, prairie can be beautiful, but at the same time, if you don't get rain, you can't grow anything.
Plus, they said it was really, really hard to plow that virgin prairie
Well,
land.
it was
Yes.
a long time of soil building and thatch building.
And those long roots, right, of the prairie plants.
Prairie roots go very, very deep in the soil, and they're heavy.
Yeah.
It's not like the cool season grasses where most root systems are finer. These are heavier and I guess beefier. I will call them beefy roots.
They said that it almost took a team of oxen to
Yes.
break it. And for a lot of people, they didn't have that option. They had maybe gone out there with a horse or two, and that really didn't work very well.
Wow.
But the initial tillage was a tough deal. And some of the other things that they had to have when they lived on it, you had to be 21 to file.
Okay.
But in those days, you didn't go in there and show your driver's license.
Your birth certificate.
People lied about
Oh.
that a lot. There were a lot of really young people out there that said they were 21 and they weren't. The other thing was you could not have fought against the U.S. So this is 1862, Civil War going on.
Okay.
So if you had been in the Confederate Army, they really didn't want you to take part in this. But again, you don't know. It wasn't like they could get on their laptop and say, "Oh, I'm sorry."
Right.
Yes.
Right.
You are not eligible.
You could tell them whatever
Pretty much, yeah.
they wanted, and there you were.
And then you were supposed to put up a dwelling on your homestead claim that was at least 12 by 14.
Yeah. Those have come back into play. They're called micro homes.
Yeah, it'd be about the size of my kitchen here.
Yeah.
But the thing was, there was a loophole.
Okay.
Because when they specified this 12 by 14, they didn't say feet.
It was just 12 by 14.
And so people would make these little
Boxes?
houses that were 12 by 14 and go out and put them on their claim and say, yeah, see, we are fulfilling our
12 by 14
our
obligation.
obligations. That's right.
Well, you got to give them an A for innovation,
Oh.
right?
Well, there were a lot of hokum pokum going on back then. I mean, people, they were really figuring out ways to get around a lot of these things.
To land grab.
Yes, they did, and to take advantage of things. There were people that they called claim jumpers that would, there were fights over
They'd steal your claim.
that. Yeah, it was, and it was out in the West. There wasn't like you could call 911.
Right.
So it got pretty nasty, I guess. And of course, like you said, the other problem was the weather,
Right.
shortage of water, and remoteness.
Yeah. Isolation is, well, I think everybody last year dealt
With the
with.
COVID, yeah. Oh, we're really isolated, aren't we?
We're isolated. We're waving at people through our windows. But I can see where that desolation, because you're even 160 acre
Yeah.
plots away from people, I could see where that could be a challenge.
And I've stated this before too, in that in Europe, which is a lot more densely populated,
Right.
and back then especially, the idea of getting 160 acres for more or less free,
Would have been huge.
yes, because usually it was like maybe the oldest son that got the farm.
Yeah, there's only so much land to go around.
Right, and then the other kids might just have to wind up working for older brother or going somewhere else, and so here was an opportunity.
To go west and get farmland.
Right.
That wasn't the best farmland.
And in Europe, and especially in places like Germany and Poland and France, the farmers tended to live in these villages and then they went out to their land.
Right, right. Because the ag land was too precious to build houses on.
Plus, it was safer that way.
Yeah.
If you were in a
If you're in
village.
town.
Yeah, it was safer.
Yeah, those poor people got overrun way too much in history.
So when they came out here and they got their 160 acres and they're out there, and maybe your closest neighbor is 5 to 10 miles away.
Yeah.
So that was a huge, huge impact.
And no phones.
No phones, no.
No phones.
No internet, no Wi-Fi. My gosh, how did they do it? But it was really hard, and a lot of people had mental problems after a while. Being out there on this flat land and nobody around, it was tough.
Yeah. I couldn't.
It was just really,
No
really
humane
tough.
society to go get some cats for to
No.
keep your lap warm.
No.
And now I figured out where the cats came in to get the mice out of the
That's
sod.
right.
Get the mice out of the
I
sod
think they said
rows.
at one time that cats were worth a lot of money out there.
Yeah.
Because that wasn't something you usually loaded into your covered wagon. You know how cats are. So cats were considered really important. And do you know that the Homestead Act was not repealed until 1976?
Wow.
Yeah.
Was there still eligible land at
Yes,
that point?
because they said the last person in the United States to file a homestead claim and prove up on it was in 1974, a man named Ken Deerdorf up in southwest Alaska.
Oh. Okay.
Isn't that amazing?
Wow. So they were giving away land for a long time.
They did. And they also, in 1873, they passed what was called the Timber Culture Act. And that meant that you could get another additional 160 acres. But
Okay.
you had to plant trees on it, a certain number of
Oh,
trees.
okay.
And you didn't have to live on it. There was no residency requirement. So that, I know a lot of people tried that. But again, if you don't have enough rain,
Trees,
tough.
yeah.
Yeah, it
And
was
trees
tough.
need moisture.
but they had the idea that they were going to start, get forestry going out on the plains.
Yeah.
And that wasn't a real success. And then they had what they called the Enlarged Homestead Act. That was 1909. And this is what actually affected my family on my mother's side. Now, my grandfather was actually born on a homestead out in, well, it was right on the border of eastern Colorado and western Nebraska.
Okay.
And they had moved out there and they had taken up a tree claim as well. I think that they proved up at some point, but again, it just proved to be a real disaster as far as farming.
Yeah.
And so they wound up coming back to Wisconsin. My grandfather was born on this homestead out there.
And how many years were they there?
It had to be over 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah, because by the time they started coming back, and the kids were all born out there, some of the kids were like 12 and 13,
Okay.
so
they really toughed it out.
they did. It just didn't work.
Yeah.
And but okay, here's this enlarged Homestead Act, and there was still some land out there, and that was 1909. In 1918, my grandparents, my grandfather's name was Kinner Hunter, and then my grandmother was May. They decided that they were going to go out and try homesteading in eastern Montana.
Oh, okay. Further
Yeah.
west.
Yes, they had some relatives out there, and they were fairly successful, and this was still, you could still homestead. So they went out there and tried that. And again, they were just out there. My grandma said her nearest neighbor was 5 miles away.
Wow.
And this is what they were living in. This was their homestead shanty.
Oh my
It
goodness.
was really pretty bleak. My mother was born out there. And I don't know how they got through the winters. I just don't understand it. It must have been terrible. They had a dog, an Airedale called Happy, that, in a lot of these pictures, that's the dog is in the picture. But after about 3 years, they had to give it up because there had just been no rain and they couldn't get anything to grow.
Right.
And it just proved to be more than they could handle. And I think my grandmother had had enough.
Yeah.
But it's funny because even though that it just wiped them out financially, they left there with hardly anything and had to work their way back across South Dakota. My grandfather worked on threshing crews and things
Just to get back home.
just to get back to Wisconsin. So it was a real abject failure for them. But I think they always had kind of a warm spot in their heart for Montana, because my grandma would sing me songs about Montana and tell me about,
Well, but sometimes when you're in a stressful position, that they often have really good memories associated with
yeah.
maybe getting through the struggle, or there's always that light.
They survived somehow, and my their cousins out there, Fred and Will Dock, and one had a ranch and one had a dairy farm out there,
okay.
and they were able to stay out there into the 1930s.
Okay.
They stayed a while, and but they were like the real cowboys and cowgirls.
Yep.
But
Ranchers.
I think my grandmother had told me that living out there was very hard on your complexion,
Oh,
hot and dry.
and windy.
Yes, yes. So it wasn't a great success for them. But like I say, they still seem to have good memories. And not everybody, of course, we said that there was a lot of people did manage.
Right.
They figured it out, they stayed, and at some point they did, move out of that little shanty and build something that was a little more substantial. And hopefully they started planting windbreaks around their property, around their homestead.
Yeah.
And it did finally work. It was a...
Well, they had to learn within what the landscape was going to give them.
Yeah, they had to learn how to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah. This wasn't Germany. This wasn't France. Or
It wasn't
Poland.
Wisconsin with lots of
No.
moisture, or
Right.
The eastern
Yeah.
states. We have a lot more moisture. I mean,
do.
once you get beyond Minnesota, it dries out pretty quick.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And a lot of people around here back then, when they had large families, like your great grandpa with his 22 kids.
There we go.
For a lot of young couples and young men would go farther west.
Yeah.
And so I know there's a lot of people around here that still have relatives like out in the Dakotas.
Right.
And that was kind of, it was that draw that, it's pretty settled up around here, but you could go farther west.
And you can find a place for you.
You could find a place. And I think that's what, got my grandparents out there too, because my grandfather had older brothers, and he kind of knew he wasn't going to get the farm, but
Right.
here
Well,
was
you
his
got to
chance.
you got to do the math.
Yeah. Right. But it was hard on so many people, and I can't ever say, it was a failure for a lot of people, but the fact that they even tried it.
Well, you got to give them credit.
Oh,
And
huge.
that's the one thing I kind of always laugh, because if everything we do is always a success, we don't learn. It's in failing is where you learn.
Yeah, that's right. Hopefully.
Yeah. Or, things go south really fast.
Hopefully.
But it's a learning experience.
There's a curve.
Yes.
And there was really a curve there when it came to homesteading.
I had the opportunity to talk a little bit about soil conservation, and the soil conservation ethic that we have today is rebuilding. There's a gap.
Yeah.
We forgot about soil conservation for a while.
Right. That just didn't enter into the mix. did
No,
it?
no. And hopefully we'll get strips back in Trempealeau County. Yay. Okay, there's the soil pitch.
Okay. Now, it was really interesting, and there's some really good books written about homesteading.
Okay.
And the one that comes to mind for me are the books by Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Yes.
She really wrote authentic, about her life out there. They'd been out in, I think it was Kansas, and then they were living in Minnesota, and then finally the Dakotas. And she wrote they said that her things were very factual.
Yes.
She wrote about the way it was.
Right.
And when you read her books, especially the older ones like Shores of Silver Lake and Little Town on the Prairie and Happy Golden Years, it talks about how tough it was, because you could have this beautiful crop of wheat and a hailstorm could come just like that and wipe you out.
Right.
Or if it wasn't that, it was grasshoppers.
Right.
Or there were a lot of things that impeded your push to become successful.
Of which you had zero control over.
Right. And you had to get through those winters with the blizzards. You had to be prepared.
Yes.
And there's some tough lessons there. Her daughter, who was called Rose Wilder Lane, also wrote, I think, a really good book about homesteading that most people have never heard of, called Free Land.
Oh.
Very good book. It's about a young couple out there trying to homestead in the Dakotas.
On free land.
Yeah. And then there was Willa Cather, who was from Nebraska. She wrote a couple of books, one called Old Pioneers, another one called My Antonia, and those are really good books. They talk about, the struggles out there in Nebraska as well. And My Antonia especially talks about a family of Czechs.
Okay.
And the father had been a musician or something, so he wasn't a real success at farming. But these are really good books, and if you're interested in that, you should try, looking into reading these books.
Well, it gives you another slice to the American experience.
It is, and the homesteading ethic, the whole idea of going out there on your own and getting 160 acres of land, almost free.
Yes.
It had to be overwhelming.
That's almost like the first social program to build homesteads.
Yeah, it was.
Because now there's government programs, I think, for first-time home buyers.
Right,
and
they try to help.
You try to,
Yeah.
kind of boost things up a little bit, and that goes way back to what, 1862.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
And the fact that it was such a, it was a real level playing field in that you didn't have to be white, you didn't have to be a citizen, you didn't even have to be a man, which is pretty amazing.
It is.
And there were women that went out there and homesteaded by themselves.
And hopefully they were successful.
Yeah, and there was also a great shortage of women out there. There were a lot of bachelors.
Well, that's that free-wielding conquer spirit that goes into it.
And a lot of them would advertise for wives back in Europe, and, tried to get them to come over. I'll pay your way, and you can marry me. And
no, they were able, if they had a sweetheart back home, they were able. If they were able to afford it, they were able to afford passage over, right?
But there was a shortage of cats and a shortage of women.
Yeah, and it's a long way from New York to the Dakota.
Yes.
To the Dakotas in the day. Yeah, Amtrak didn't go through there, I don't think.
Nope, it didn't.
But I find it interesting when you brought up that, the railways said, we'll do this. But they bought and kept mineral rights.
Right.
Under a lot, and they bought huge tracts of land because they weren't sure where this train track was ultimately going to run through. And it wasn't until the gas boom of 8 years ago that
out in the Dakotas, especially North Dakota,
a lot of people found out that even though the property that they were sitting on was their property, that they didn't own what was underneath it.
That's right, the mineral rights.
The mineral rights. And so, that push west made a lot of people rich to this day.
I've got to turn off our timer here.
It's going to keep beeping. Cut her off. Cut her off. She'll talk forever.
That's because we have our kitchen studio. We don't have people that are waving signs at us telling, all right, shut up. Well, Mary, I really appreciate you coming up here and talking about this today. It was interesting, isn't it?
And we probably still have at least a month, maybe a month and a half for good winter reading. And, and some of the books that Nancy mentioned are kind of piquing my interest.
Yeah, they're really worth reading. Interesting subject.
Yes.
And, we talk about terrible winters, but, the summers were pretty rough too, I believe. So, interesting subject. And like we say, we encourage everybody, if you're interested in it, try some of these books and learn more about...
Check out pictures on the history YouTube.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. We got to warn.
We have to warn
tell
you.
People quickly that we are going onto YouTube. WTCO has been loading some programming onto YouTube.
Awesome.
And a couple of our programs.
Yay!
So all you have to do is get on your computer
Click
device.
away.
And you punch in WTCO channel 18, and that should get you there. So click on that, and then there's other programs there too, but they can find us.
And as time goes, there will be more. So enjoy.
More and more and more. Let's just
more and more Mary Nancy.
Oh! Well, thank you, Mary, and we're going to say goodbye now from the
History Files.